This episode comes to you with support from Raisin UK, the online platform where you can grow your savings with confidence. What's more, for a limited time only, you can receive a £100 bonus when you register and fund your first savings account with a minimum of £10,000 using the code SAVINGS100. For more details, please visit the link below or go to raisin.co.uk/PensionCraft. The dream of an early retirement, sipping cocktails on a beach, or finally pursuing that passion project is a powerful motivator for many investors. But it often remains just that, a dream. So what's holding people back? Is it simply a matter of money? Or are there deeper psychological reasons why even those who could afford to clock off early decide to keep working?
And in today's dumb question of the week, is the state pension like a bond? All right, let's get into it. So, Romin, when you told me that this week you wanted to do an episode on retirement planning and early retirement, I thought, oh no, there's two problems here. Number one, I'm 38. And number two, I have not slept because my youngest daughter is teething. But the good news is you run a company called PensionCraft, so you can save the day.
Now, you might think it was to do with pensions, but it's not. It's more about investing. But I do speak to a lot of people who've retired or are planning to retire. So, yeah, I think I know a little bit about it.
I think we'll split this episode into two parts. So the first part is reasons why people can't afford to retire early. And then the second part will be reasons why people don't retire early, even if they can afford to. So let's kick it off by saying, what is the biggest mistake you come across that people have made, which means they're struggling to retire when they want to?
I think what's most shocking is the number of people who don't have a plan. They know that they have to retire at some point, but they haven't really thought about the financial implications of doing that, or how much they'd need to retire, or all of those important numerical things which make it possible. And it's pretty unlikely you're going to accidentally find yourself in a state where, oh, I can retire.
Yeah.
And of course, if you don't have a plan, you may not even know you can retire because you don't know how much you're going to need in order to retire. So all of these things require some planning and some degree of expectation management, I'd say.
Do you think for younger people these days, it's more of a case that it seems like an impossibility that they could ever retire? There's so many calls on their money. We know wage growth has been poor in the UK for a long time. And you just sort of ignore the problem, right? It's a bit like climate change. It seems such a big problem, so hard to solve. You just pretend it's not going to happen.
Does it feel like that? Does it feel hopeless for someone who's in their 30s?
Well, I think it's very much an individual thing. Everyone's circumstances are different. I know people who just bury their head in the sand and don't really care about their pension. They know there's an auto-enrollment going on. And they think, oh, maybe that will get me there in conjunction with the state pension at some point. But me, I've always taken the other route, right? I'm too interested maybe in my finances.
Well, casting my faltering memory back to my 30s, I think I probably didn't think about it very much at that time. And I just assumed everything would be okay. I knew that money was being put into the pension. I didn't really think about what it was invested in, what the forecasted return was. It was just assumed that that would be fine.
It's a bit like that John Lennon quote, isn't it? Everything will be okay in the end. If it's not okay, it's not the end. I think that's how people think about their retirement planning. I also think that's a fake quote.
But I think a lot of the problems stem from that lack of planning. And I think here again, education really helps because people don't really realise that they have to save until it's too late. And you get huge compounding if you start early, even if the amounts you save aren't huge. The irony is that when you get the greatest compounding benefits, you have the least money to invest. So if you do start early, I think that can make a massive difference later on. And conversely, if you start too late, it's a real problem. And I do speak to people who are in that boat, who only come to think about these things once the end of work is within sight.
I suppose that's the major problem preventing people from retiring, is that they've not started early enough and not saved enough and invested enough along the journey.
Or even to realise that money that you invest actually does some of the heavy lifting. It's not all about how much you put into it. You also get very good returns if you invest in the right things, primarily equity. And again, people don't know how much equity returns. If you ask the average person in the street how much a stock's going to give you over the next 20 years,
they'll say, why are you talking to me? I'm in the street on my way to Lidl.
So this is a Nando's, yeah.
Your point is they don't have an idea around the returns of equity, or an intuitive understanding of the power of compounding?
I think that's true for most people. And that's a problem because if you don't understand it, you can't use it.
And if you don't start early and you end up planning for your retirement late in your 40s and 50s, then it really does become about how much money you can save more than expecting investing to do some of the heavy lifting for you.
Yeah, a lot of the pounds that you put in are the pounds you take out. Compounding is not going to help you much. So I think that can be a huge problem. And again, this is due to education. And most people just can't be bothered until it's too late.
That definitely plays a role, but it seems so far away. There's a lot of other things to focus on when you're in your 20s. But for a lot of people, it's also just practically impossible to save more with the wages they're earning. They've got to try and buy a house. That needs a big deposit. They might have kids. That's costly. Tutting at people and saying, well, you should be putting more than the default 5% into your pension from your salary seems a little harsh.
And yet there's really no choice if you do want to be able to retire. And for some people, I think they won't be able to retire. That's the danger.
Or at least they'll have a meager retirement and it won't happen until the state pension kicks in.
Yeah, they'll be in this unfortunate situation where they may rely on the next generation to bail them out, or horror of horrors, they're going to have to live with their own children and be financially dependent on their children. So, that's not going to be good for the kids or for you psychologically. There is actually a flip side to this, which is some of the people I spoke to when I was younger simply said, look, if I ever require a pension, I'll have failed. I'm just going to be super rich because I'm going to have this brilliant business plan. I'm going to have my own company and I won't need a pension, which is nice to be optimistic, to have that positive mindset. But you've got to be realistic about what is possible and the likelihood of success.
Playing the lottery is not a pension plan, is it?
No. So it's all about working out what is likely to work for the average person and realizing that you probably are an average person.
I think in some sense you have to be conservative with your assumptions here. You have to think that I'm not going to get super rich. I am going to be reliant on saving from my salary. I am going to get the historically normal returns on my investment portfolio, or maybe below that. Inflation might be above target for most of my life. Maybe it'll be 3% instead of 2%. And you have to put all that into the model and go, oh man, I need to save more money now.
So that kind of wake-up call is good if it comes early on, because that's when you can really do the big course corrections. So I think if you do have someone in your family which is at that point in their career, or if you yourself are at that point in your career, it's certainly worth putting a little bit of thought in early on and planning.
In some ways, it helps if you have a job that you hate early on, because then you might realize, I can't do this forever.
Yeah, that was certainly true for me. I thought, I was in a role which I really didn't like, and it led to better things. I planned my way out of it. But it was good in the end. I moved to a role which I really did love. And now I'm in a job which I absolutely love. So I think as long as that dissatisfaction feeds through to positive things, it can be very helpful.
I want to just go back to something I said a minute ago, which was that it helps to be conservative maybe in your planning. Where it doesn't help to be conservative when you're young is in your asset allocation. If you're in your 20s, you can afford to take some risk. Not crazy risk, but the risk of having a portfolio that is heavily into equity.
And that would make a lot of sense. And I think that is quite scary for people starting out, particularly if you're a cautious person. But absolutely, if you're going to be putting money aside for many years, and that's the case if you're starting in your 20s, 30s, then equity is the natural choice. That 5-6% above inflation return is going to be absolutely critical for you. And again, if you don't know that's what you're going to get on average, then that could be a problem. And it can lead to overcautious asset allocation, which could be catastrophic.
We've talked in the past about how most people in the UK are just invested through their default pension plan at work. And often the trouble with these plans is that they're not tailored for you and your risk appetite. And perhaps they're overly cautious because people don't like to see a short-term fall in the value of their savings. So if you are on this route targeting early retirement, you really need to look at what you're actually invested in.
And companies often make that difficult. I often speak to people who show me what their workplace pension offers, and it is very restricted. The choice of funds is often quite expensive and also doesn't have the really bread and butter stuff like a global equity fund, which is low fee, global bond fund, which is low fee, money market fund, which is low fee. It's very odd choices of fund that go with the workplace pension. And as more people become more engaged with investing, I think that'll change. I think they'll insist on workplace pensions, giving you that kind of bread and butter choice, which is more reasonable. And workers don't feel empowered to make a change, when of course it should be up to them what kind of choices they've got in their pension plan. So pushing back on your employer, ensuring that you do have those choices is really important.
I think it's strange and a kind of historical accident that our retirement planning is so tightly bound up with our employer, because now obviously people move employers so many times generally in their career that it's weird. And a lot of people end up with, a dozen pension pots over their career. And obviously you can go about consolidating those, but it's not a natural fit these days. But anyway, that's the world we live in. But you did touch upon something there, which was fees and how some of these schemes may carry higher fees than is really necessary. And that's another thing people underappreciate with investing, is that fees make a massive difference.
And again, I think the metaphor of harvesting is useful here. If you're harvesting 5% per year real return and you're paying 1% in fees, well, you're giving up a fifth of your return. And that's a huge problem over the longer term. And again, people aren't sensitive to this. They think, oh, it's a small percentage, I'll be absolutely fine. But in fact, you have to think of the percentage relative to your expected return. And in fact, any kind of percentage fee is bad for you, because as your investment grows, the fees scale up with it. Absolute fees, where you just pay a fixed amount every year, are the ones to go for. And when you invest in your own platform, invest in your own funds, at least you can choose platforms which are fixed fee as the amount of invested money increases. So that pernicious effect of the tyranny of fees can be mitigated to some extent if you've got control and knowledge of what fees you're paying.
Now, we've touched on a lot of stuff here which might prevent you building up a big enough pot to sustain you throughout your retirement. And if you're thinking, how big should the pot be? Well, that's a whole topic in itself. As a ballpark, a lot of people will say the 4% rule is a good rule of thumb to start with, whereby you can withdraw 4% from the pot you retire with every year, uprated for inflation. And the stats generally say, in a worst case, that might last you through 30 years. In the UK, I think that's a bit high. 3.5%, maybe even lower, is realistic. But anyway, as a rule of thumb, let's say 4%. It keeps the numbers easy. Working back from that, if you know how much you're going to spend each year in retirement, you can times it by 25 and get the pot size you need. Now, if we're thinking about why people can't afford to retire early, it's because they haven't got a big enough pot, right? We've talked about the things that might prevent that: fees, not starting early enough, not saving enough, maybe lifestyle creep along the way. But there are tripwires the closer you get to retirement. So we've talked about not being too conservative with your asset allocation when you're young. But if you have a target retirement date in mind, you probably want to de-risk as you approach that. And that maybe is another reason that people can't afford to retire early, is that they get unlucky with the timing of a market crash just before they might want to retire.
Yeah, and I've spoken to many people in that situation where sometimes not because of any fault of their own, their financial advisor put them into funds which turned out to be quite risky. For example, if you bought growth stocks going into 2022, there was a huge pullback in growth stocks over that year. And of course, the funds that people bought at that time were the ones which had performed best over the previous decade, which were growth stocks. So I think you can get sucked into these asset allocations, which don't seem risky. It does look diversified. But in fact, you've got a big tilt to one factor, to one country, to one sector. And if that's the case, then you're subject to big drawdowns sometimes. So this whole thing about de-risking as you approach retirement is really important. But also understanding what risk is, understanding that a big tilt is risky because things change and you can get big turnarounds. But also understanding what's safe. What is it that's safe? Is a money market fund safe? Is a gilt safe, a UK government bond? What is it that's going to give you that safety when everything is in a state of flux? For example, at the moment, I get many people who are worried that UK gilts or that money market funds or that bank accounts even are not safe. So understanding those risks, understanding what's safe and how to de-risk and when to de-risk, all of that's very important too.
One of the annoying things, actually, if early retirement is your goal, is that money you save into a pension in the UK can't be accessed until 57, at least by the time we get there. Now, if you want to retire at 50, you need some money to bridge that gap. So one thing that might prevent some people retiring when they want to is that the money is locked away from them for a few more years.
Yeah, we've now got that line in the sand, haven't we, at the age of 57, when you can start to draw on the pension. And another age, which is really important, is the state pension age. And the government website has a checker because it's so complex to work out what your state pension age will be. But that's another really important point in your life, because the state pension, although it doesn't seem very generous, is really useful. And if you do these cash flow simulations in the future, you can see how important it is and the fact that it's inflation linked. It's often the case that that does a lot of the heavy lifting later on in retirement.
But if your goal is to retire early, at least before 57, say, then it does require some careful planning to get the mix, not just around asset allocation, but around where you're holding those assets. Is it in ISAs? Is it in pensions? How much in each?
And here again, if you have the ability to put some money into ISAs, they do give you that greater flexibility because you can withdraw money from that tax-free at any point in time. And that flexibility is incredibly useful for these gap periods. So yes, you can draw on the ISA until you reach the pension retirement age. And then when you reach the state pension age, again, that kicks in and gives you another leg up. So really, it's a matter of bridging these periods and having the money set aside until you can draw on those other two sources. Now, for many people, they've put too much into their SIP because we had this period when SIPs were very tax efficient when it came to inheritance. And unfortunately, we're now in a position where that's not true. So here the legislation's really screwed a lot of people, I think. And there is a lot of anger, justifiable anger about that.
But just to wrap up this section, maybe the most frustrating thing here is you might have done everything right. You might have started early, saved enough, invested in the right things, not been tempted by lifestyle creep, de-risked at the right time, kept your fees low, and be on course for your dream retirement. But then life gets in the way.
So, for example, you might find yourself being one of these silver splitters. I was in that situation where a divorce happens and suddenly what you thought you'd have is very different to what you actually have.
Right.
And your plans have got to adjust for that. I don't think people should plan for divorce because I think that's really kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. But understanding that it might happen is important. So building some leeway into your financial plans is always a good idea for these unexpected events.
And it is massively costly, even if it's all amicable, just because you've got to run two households now, probably on the same amount of money.
That's right. And there are lots of costs that go with divorce. So it may be that your pot is quite depleted by the event itself, even if, as you say, it is an amicable split. Plus, it's not just about relationships between yourself and your partner. It might also be relationships between yourself and your employer. It could be that you have a huge career setback, that you get fired, that you have to take a lower salary as you get older, which is always unexpected. We always assume that the income is a line that gradually goes up over time, but of course that's not always true. Or it might be that you're so pissed off with your job that you say, look, screw this, I'm going to switch to a career which is less financially rewarding, but is much more personally rewarding in terms of perhaps your ethics or perhaps to do with your personal satisfaction.
Here's a former investment banker talking.
We always had a plan B.
I think you're right, though. I come across this a lot now in my friendship groups and with people I used to work with, where I think there's a lot of dissatisfaction with the kind of modern workplace and a yearning to get out and not have to keep going until your 60s.
I think for a lot of people, it's about choice, what you do to fill your day. If someone's telling you what to do, it's very different from you doing what you choose to do. So I think that freedom, that control is what people find most rewarding.
It's a hard trade-off to make when you really want to leave. You're on the verge of burnout, but you think, I should probably stick out this high salary for a little while longer. But anyway, that's something we can come on to in part 2.
This episode is brought to you by Raisin UK, the smarter way to grow your savings. Compare savings accounts from over 40 trusted banks and apply to open in just a few clicks. What's more, for a limited time only, you can receive a £100 bonus when you register and fund your first savings account with a minimum of £10,000 using the code SAVINGS100. For more details, please visit the link below or go to raisin.co.uk/PensionCraft.
So in part one, we covered the reasons why people might not be able to afford to retire when they want to. But now let's focus on why people don't retire early, even if they can afford to, and perhaps want to.
Now, financial planners tell me there's a really rewarding part of their job, which is someone comes to them and says, look, when can I retire? And they do the sums and suddenly they realize, well, actually, you could retire today.
You could have retired 2 years ago.
But the expression on their clients' faces when they tell them this is sheer joy in many cases. So I think many people don't realize they could retire because they haven't done the sums and they don't realize what they'd need to retire. So again, this comes back to our plan.
It almost needs a whole new plan, doesn't it, retirement? It's such a specific thing when you start drawing on your nest egg rather than contributing to it. It's a real shift in how the finances work, but also how your psychology works, seeing it shrink over time.
And we see this in the community and PensionCraft, where people are saying, look, I've just retired and I just can't face the prospect of seeing my number go down rather than up.
Yeah.
And that is a huge shift, realizing that actually you don't have to put stuff in anymore. You've worked hard for a long time and now you deserve to draw this money out. That's why you saved.
But we built in this instinctive Pavlovian response to number goes up. That's the goal, at least in the short term. And it became hardwired. And now we've got to sort of snap that and think about maximizing something other than our spreadsheet.
And I think people don't have this inbuilt ability to think about hedonism. And they feel bad about hedonism. I don't know if it's because we're a Christian society where thinking about enjoyment.
Oh, here we go.
Where thinking about enjoyment is not necessarily something we feel comfortable doing. And yet I think that's the way we should think. What is it that I enjoy in life? And how can I afford to pay for that for the rest of my years on this earth? Because that's what you're doing with retirement. You've got a choice about what you can do and how you spend your time. So make sure that you spend it well. So there the utility function changes. Now it's about what can I do to maximize my enjoyment with the amount of money I've got left.
But do you think people really know what makes them happy? Now here we're going way off the beaten track of an investment podcast, but still, it is the question at hand, isn't it, when you face retirement?
I think what's interesting here, just speaking to people, is sometimes people are swayed by what they think they should enjoy. In other words, it's about a social aspect where you think, well, this is what I'm supposed to like. You don't think of it in those terms, but we're bombarded in the media about things that, in theory, we should like. I should like to travel around the world because that's what, that's what's cool and that's what people should enjoy. That's what I read in the Times colour supplement.
Having recently been on a plane with 2 kids under the age of 4, I can say right now travel doesn't seem so appealing.
Yeah, I hate travel. I did a lot of travelling as a kid and frankly, never being on a plane ever again would be fine by me. But for many people, that's what they want to do in retirement.
I think a big thing here, I imagine people think as they're approaching retirement, is kind of like a fear of the unknown. Like, what will I do with my time? And in fact, when I was researching this episode, I came across a good thread on the Bogleheads forum from people who had retired. And the question was, what is the most annoying question people ask you as an early retiree? And it was always, what do you do with your time? I think that my favourite answer was someone said, well, what do you do with your Saturday?
A good point. Now, I speak to quite a few people who are entrepreneurs, or maybe they describe themselves as people who are very self-driven, where they say, well, instead of retiring, I'm going to start a new company, or I'm going to do another job, a job which I've made and which doesn't require me to generate an income, but which, again, is focused on this satisfaction aspect. Could be charitable, could be a startup, could be software, anything which they love and which gives them joy. But again, that requires this level of self-knowledge, knowing what it is that you're going to enjoy. And it may be that you try it out and it turns out, well, actually, no, I'm just going to take it easy.
But seriously, do you think this is something that does prevent some people from pulling the trigger and retiring is that they think, well, what do I do? I've been in the workplace for the last 30 years. When that alarm clock doesn't go off in the morning, what's going to get me out of bed?
I think for people who've got very technical, specific knowledge, I think that is the difficulty, because you can't really move out of that and do something similar. If you're a nuclear engineer, then are you going to make your own little nuclear reactor in the back garden? No.
Small modular reactors, Roman, they're a thing now, apparently. Certainly people are trying to get me to invest in them.
But you speak to people who work in finance and they have a very specific knowledge about a specific asset class, and they are the world expert in that thing. So what are they going to do in retirement?
Is it easier to retire as a generalist, do you think? You were a generalist, right? You were a cross-asset strategist.
Yeah, but strategist is quite a specific role in terms of what it required me to do. And I think for me, the difficulty wasn't so much the role as the mental stimulus of the people I worked with. You know, zipping around, talking to fund managers, talking to people within the investment bank. That was hugely stimulating. And also it was my social life because it was such long hours.
Hey, Roman, I stimulate you.
Yeah, that's one of the benefits of this podcast, which is that I do have someone I can talk to about investing. Whereas when I first started, it was just me in a room. You know, that was a huge change, and one I hadn't really prepared for at all, and which I hadn't prepared for personally either. You know, it was a big shock to my family to suddenly have me around all the time rather than being the absent dad.
I feel like you should be lying down on a black sofa right now, feet up. I'm stroking a beard. But I think you touched on a point there, which is the kind of idea that your work often gives you an identity and a status. And stepping away from that could be scary. As well as losing your social network, you lose the answer to the question, well, what are you? I guess. And not that everyone should have their identity tied up with their work, but for a lot of people, I think it is a big component of who they are.
Yeah, there is a sense in which you are slipping away. You know, it's a process of death starting. You know, that's the extreme way of looking at it, which is that someone who was professionally very successful, potentially, now is in a state where, you know, they're just shuffling around their house in a cardigan. And it's hard to have that respect when you're on that kind of level playing field where your role no longer defines you.
I wonder if you could move into a sort of mentorship role where you help the people who are following in your footsteps. And then maybe you can keep some of your identity and status if that's what you want.
Yeah, a lot of people go into teaching, I think, as a result of wanting to maintain these relationships in retirement, but also the stimulus of speaking to young people, which is great. You know, as you get older, you love the enthusiasm of young people, but also the huge relief that you don't have to go through that again. So I think mentorship is a good choice. But really, as you said earlier, it's difficult to know what you want until you've actually tried various things out. So one suggestion I've heard, which is a great one, is semi-retire before you retire, just to check out that what you've got in your plan is going to be something which works for you, both financially and also emotionally.
Do you mean in the sense of take a 6-month sabbatical and try it out if you can?
Well, more you kind of cut down your working hours and then spend the days when you're not working doing whatever it is you're planning to do in retirement. For example, spending time with your partner, doing the new activity, whatever that is, just to make sure that it's something which is rewarding.
It definitely helps to know what you're retiring to, not just what you're moving away from. But I think even if you get there and you form a plan of what I'm going to do with the next, hopefully 30, 40 years of my life, it's still hard to step away. You see a lot of talk online about 1 more year syndrome. I'll just work 1 more year. And you say that for 5 years in a row. The goalposts keep moving.
And again, this is the psychology behind not realizing you have enough. You've got to draw a line at a certain point and say, look, this is enough. I may not be super rich, but it's about managing expectations.
It's hard, isn't it, though, to say this is enough because it's not binary. If we go back to that 4% rule we said earlier, let's say you're a high earner and you can save £100,000 a year, just to keep the numbers easy. What you're buying there, if you work 1 more year and save and invest another £100,000, is £4,000 every year for the rest of your life.
But £4,000 per year for a diminishing life. And then it's a question of how many years do you want to carry on working and potentially accumulating? And how many years do you want to spend enjoying? And here I think that hedonism idea is an important one. Don't be guilty about taking time off and doing what you like. If work's what you like, then sure, stay in the role that you're enjoying. But I think for many people, that's not true. They work to live, they don't live to work.
But you think, oh, if I work one more year, I get that extra bit of money every year for the rest of my life. I can fly business class instead of economy when I'm traveling. Do you know what I mean? Like, you move the goalposts kind of rationally because you think, oh, maybe that is worth an extra year.
But that's driven by your own choices and what you enjoy. For some people, they don't want to fly business class. Their pleasures are fairly simple and they're quite happy to draw a line under their career.
I want to fly business class, but I want my daughters to be back in economy, far away from me. But what is interesting here, and it's kind of related to this one more year syndrome, is that your company might not want you to retire, and they might put incentives in place to try to stop you from making that decision. So they might have bonuses and stock options or promises of a promotion, all this kind of stuff, which you think, oh, rationally, I should probably stick it out until I get that stuff.
And it's also flattering if your work is saying that you're irreplaceable, even though we all know it's not true. It feels great if they want to keep you. And I think that switch into a world in which you no longer have the ability to generate more upside. Your upside is now capped. You're moving into the fixed income space where you don't get upside. It's only downside. It's just about limiting the downside at that point. Another way of seeing it is it's a lack of agency. When you're 30, you always think, well, if I do this, this, and this, I can change my future. In retirement, that's different. You really can't change the future. You can just consume less.
Yeah, it kind of flips the responsibility, doesn't it? Rather than you tending to your investment pot, making sure it grows nicely, your investment pot has to tend to you. But you see these kind of incentives to get people to keep working built into all sorts of aspects of society, not just employment contracts, but also the fact that the state pension requires you to work for a certain number of years to qualify. And if you want to max it out, currently you need to work for 35 qualifying years. If you're there and you've got 33 qualifying years, you might think, well, I guess I'll do another 2 then. Even though you might be fairly well off and that extra 2 years uplift in your state pension doesn't make a huge difference. You can always buy the years, actually.
Well, in some cases you can. I'm in this position myself. I've just got 1 more year until I get my full state pension. So,
well, until you qualify for it, you're not going to actually get it for quite a while yet.
No, that's right. That's right. But I'm weirdly focused on that last year of work. I mean, I'm not going to retire, but it is nice to think that I'll get the full whack of state pension when I do start to draw on it.
Unless they move the goalposts, which is always possible.
That would be quite annoying.
But all of this is kind of a temptation to keep working, to build up a bigger pot or a bigger income in the future, which might stop you deciding to retire now. Another thing that might push you in that direction is if your partner, your spouse, is not ready to retire themselves, because then you might be moving on to fairly different life stages at different times.
And that can be difficult. If you're pottering around the house when your partner's still having to get up at 7 in the morning or 5 in the morning and go and schlep, well, that's difficult. You have to present yourself as not being a layabout when there's this kind of mismatch between your lifestyle and theirs. Of course, it is a transition time. It won't last forever. But for couples where there's a big age difference, it can be an issue.
Do you think there's also a question of societal expectation and pressure, especially for people who retire early, let's say in your 40s? You might be worried about being judged if you retire at 45, even though you'll have worked hard and it's your money. You can retire if you want to and can afford it.
I think that's definitely true. I think society doesn't look well on people who have retired if they retire early. In the same way that if you live off a trust fund at age 30, then people look down on you in many cases. So it's really just a slightly less extreme version of that.
If you go down that route of retiring very early, I think you have to try and craft a response to the question of, what do you do? Because everyone asks that. It's the first thing anyone asks when you meet them, which is a weird thing in our society. But the question is, what do you do? And the expectation is you'll reply with some kind of job. That's what I do. I'm a teacher. I'm a lawyer. I'm an accountant. Like, that's who I am. So you have to try and think of something else to say to that question rather than just, I don't do anything.
Well, it's not true. It's impossible not to do anything.
Of course it's not true.
I'm spending more time with my money. That's not going to go down very well with people, I suspect.
I always think it's nice to frame a response to that question as something you're actually contributing to society. Like rather than saying, I'm a financial advisor, say, I help people meet their financial goals. Like that's what you do. You're not what the job title says. And that might still be true after you retire. If you're a retired financial planner, well, maybe you still do help people meet their goals when you talk to them.
What many people choose to do in retirement is to look after their family. So as grandparents, you often end up looking after the kids. And I'm not sure what the description of that would be. Childminder.
Probably less relevant to early retirees in their 40s. You'd have done well to have grandkids at that point. It might happen. But talking of grandkids and kids, I think one very common reason why people don't retire early, despite being able to afford to, is that they wish to pass on a greater inheritance to their heirs. And so they'll keep working to build that.
I heard an interesting stat recently where there was a description of when people generally inherit, and it's usually in their 60s. By that point, they'll already have finished their own career pretty much, and they'll probably have maybe even retired. So I think inheriting at that point isn't particularly useful. Plus, it may be that many of the people that you leave money to are people you don't even know, partners that come onto the scene later on after you've passed away. So I can see why there are reasons why you might want to pass that money on while you're still alive. And more people are choosing to do that.
But is it worth delaying your own retirement, despite it being what you want to do emotionally, because you feel an obligation to maximize your earnings to support the next generation?
For many people, I think it is important. When we have discussions about saving, a large part of that conversation is about how much they're going to have as legacy for their kids. Other people say, look, we've got the house, the kids are going to get that when I die, and that's it. If I have money left over, so much the better. But I'm not planning to do that. And some people say, look, I don't want to leave anything for my kids because I think they should work hard to achieve something in life. Otherwise, they may not be motivated to contribute to society. So I see huge variation in people's approach to legacy.
I wonder if a lot of people have a belief that we've lived in some ways, the golden era for building wealth. Who knows what the world of employment will be like for our children, and if they'll be able to build up wealth like we did. There's a lot of reasons why they might not be able to, and so maybe it's rational for me to try and maximize my career on their behalf.
I think that's quite a downbeat assessment of where we are going in the future. I'm not convinced that there is going to be lower return in the future because who knows what's going to be around the corner. There may be technological advances, there may be societal changes, which mean that things are going to improve a lot. And I always try to be an optimist when it comes to these kind of things because it's easy to be a pessimist and say, look, the best is behind us. And it's hard to see where we're headed. So I think I wouldn't be so negative about it. I think that the future may well be better than the past. It may be that this is the difficult period.
Yeah, maybe. Maybe it will be better. And I guess it's hard enough to plan your own retirement without worrying about planning your children's retirement.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think it's more important to focus on your plans for your retirement, and then plans for your kids and the next generation should be secondary. Now you can see that one size certainly doesn't fit all when it comes to retirement, and it's always useful to have someone to discuss this with, and that's one of the things we provide on a one-to-one basis. If you want to learn more about our coaching, go to pensioncraft.com/coaching.
Okay, today's dumb question of the week. Is the state pension like a bond?
I certainly do hear people describe it that way, and I can see what they mean. It does have a steady set of cash flows. They are inflation linked, certainly at the moment. So yeah, it is a little bit like a fixed income instrument.
I've seen people say that too. And especially once they get to the state pension age and start receiving those cash flows, they think, well, maybe that actually could fulfill the role of some of my bond component in my portfolio. I'm not sure that's the best way of looking at things. For a start, one reason we might hold bonds in addition to equity, is to allow us to rebalance either on a fixed schedule or when there's a severe market move, which provides a rebalancing bonus when you look at the maths of how portfolios work. Now, you can't rebalance from the state pension.
No, really, the only diversification it offers is an income stream which doesn't depend on how markets move. So in that sense, it's kind of remote from your equity holdings because the income doesn't change. But that's not real diversification, as you say, because you can't really think about the principal amount of your state pension because it doesn't really have one. So it's really just one half of a bond. It's just the income stream. It's not the principal value. That's been stripped away from you and that's been paid into this invisible Ponzi fund.
Ooh, a controversial way of describing it. But I get where you're coming from. You can't pass on the state pension, right? You can't say, well, I'm not going to spend it and I'll just give my heirs like 200 grand or whatever it's worth. For me, the correct way to think about the state pension is that it will contribute to some of your expenses and lower the amount you need to withdraw from your investment pot once you reach state pension age.
Yeah, so in that sense, it reduces the hurdle of income that you have to generate in order to just live. And that's very useful.
But there is risk involved here, despite the fact it's a guaranteed stream of income. It's only guaranteed in the sense that the government decides to keep paying it. It's always subject to political risk. And I know a lot of people think about this. A lot of people doubt whether there will be a state pension when they get to retirement age. I think there will be. I think it would be inconceivable, really, for a government to take it away. They wouldn't stay in office very long, were they, to do that? But that's not to say the risk isn't there about what the value will be and the terms it's paid on and whether it might be in some ways means tested.
So the thing we're always talking about is the triple lock, which is unsustainable and probably will be taken away, at least some parts of it. Maybe it'll become a double lock or even a single lock. It might just be linked to inflation.
I suppose, really, to be consistent, it should just be linked to one thing, whether that's average wage growth or a share of GDP or a share of government spending. It should be consistent at that level, whatever you link it to over time. The danger of linking it to lots of different things and making it the best of all those things is that inevitably, over the long term, the older cohort of society is going to get richer relative to the younger cohort.
So I think it's a bit of a stretch to say that it's like a bond at all. All you can really say is that it's like an annuity.
But still, a very important part of retirement planning. Don't ignore it. Thank you for joining us for Many Happy Returns. Keep sending us your questions, no matter how dumb, at mhr@pensioncraft.com.
And do remember to check out PensionCraft.com for all the information about our membership, courses, and investment coaching options.
Many Happy Returns is a PensionCraft production, co-hosted and executive produced by Romin Nakiza and Michael Pugh. This podcast is for informational and entertainment purposes and is not financial advice. We do not provide recommendations or endorse any decision to buy, sell, or hold any security. We cannot be held responsible for any actions listeners may take, and investors are encouraged to seek independent financial advice.